Welcome everyone. The presentation is about to begin. The session will be recorded and it's going to last 60 minutes. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentation and turn off web cameras. If you have a question or a comment, you can enter it in the chat during the presentation and the presenter will address your question at the end. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which is going to be available a week after today. And I will go ahead and introduce the presenter now. From the TESOL International Association NNEST-IS Intersection, we're very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar. My name is Christina and I'm going to be the moderator for today's event. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Rashi Jain, whose session is entitled Recentering Practice in Professional Identity Constructions, Practice-Based Perspectives from a Transnational-Translingual Pracademic. Thank you, Dr. Jain, for being here and for sharing your work with us, and everybody for attending. Whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and start, and I am going to mute myself as of right now.
Thanks so much, Christina and Mai. I really appreciate again you inviting me to give this webinar. And I noticed that we already have people in the audience. So because it's a smaller number right now, I would like to acknowledge the person who's here, Gitanjali Chabra. It's also a name that's quite familiar because it sounds very Indian, very desi to me. It could be from South Asia too. So welcome everybody. I'm going to talk about the importance of practice, especially the way it's conceptualized in a lot of US-based academic settings / Western academic settings. So if you can all see the screen and you can see the title of my presentation, I am going to talk about my identity as a transnational, translingual academic today. But before I do that, here is a quick overview of what I'll be talking about. So I'm going to talk about redefining practice and reclaiming the notion of productivity, recentering practice and reimagining academia or pracademia, and then decentering quote unquote academe, and perhaps decolonizing English as well. So I'm going to talk about something that for me are like two sides of the same coin. And what do I mean by that? For a very long time, I would tell myself and colleagues, I am a practitioner primarily, which now looking back, I realize was a somewhat narrow self-identification. And I've been redefining my own conceptualization of practice, especially these past few years. So as members of a global TESOL community, we all participate in and across a wide range of professional roles. For example, some of us are teachers and instructors in K through 20 plus settings. We teach in school, university, college, community college settings. Some of us are teacher educators, researchers, mentors, administrators, and these are just some of the roles that we play out, as well as we all work in settings that span the globe. So we have a case in point here. For instance, we have people from other parts of the world, not just the US, who are attending this presentation today. And these roles and sites result in diverse, dynamic, complex, and overlapping practices. In fact, in the chat box, please indicate the roles that you currently perform and the settings where you perform these roles. So I'm just going to wait a few seconds while you share, all of you share with us what roles do you participate in, and what your current site of practice might be in terms of TESOL, in terms of English language teaching. So please go ahead and write your answer in the chat, and I'm going to go on. And yet the word practice itself continues to be narrowly perceived as, quote unquote teaching, while the term practitioner is generally interpreted as teacher as opposed to academic. However, as Wenger noted all the way back in the late 90s, some communities may specialize in the production of theories, but that too is practice. So if you think about it, this is one side of the coin where people identify practice and being a practitioner with primarily teaching. There's another side to this coin. Quite recently, a few months ago, a senior colleague said to me, "You're being so productive." And instead of thinking of it as a compliment, there was this gut reaction from me. I kind of resisted the compliment, and then I later on wondered why I had been so resistant instead of acknowledging it as a compliment, as it was obviously intended to be. And I realized that the idea of what is seen as productive in academia is a little problematic. So part of this presentation, I'm going to try and redefine the notion of productivity. So in academia, productivity is often narrowly perceived and measured primarily in terms of research grants, publications, and number of citations. You just have to open your social media and see what practices are being highlighted by colleagues and emerging and established scholars in the field to understand that this is not just anecdotal and then also research-based conversations in academia that kind of feed into this idea that the more research grants, the more publications, and the more citations you have, the more power you have, something I'm going to talk about in a few seconds. And this is largely driven by the somewhat rigid academic tenure process, especially in the West or the global North. And I am bringing, to a certain extent, US-based perspectives because I've been primarily professionally active here in the last 17 years of my life, although I will make some transnational connections as well. So I found this interesting article published on Harvard's website, where the writer is talking about do women have to be masculine to succeed in academia? And there were some really interesting points that were being made here, which kind of tie in with my questioning how productivity is measured in academia. So I'm just going to read aloud. Even in academic organizations that claim to have a flat hierarchy or no hierarchy at all, there's always an unofficial one. There are many factors that influence a person's rank in the unofficial hierarchy. Women typically rank lower than men. Those who natively speak the local language, which all of us can connect to the idea of native English speakers and non-native English speakers, especially in the Western context, rank higher than those who do not. And those who publish in more prestigious journals, get bigger grants or awards, or receive funding for longer, typically rank higher. The higher in the hierarchy one is, the more influence they have on the decision-making process, and the more their status, respect, and ability to exercise influence grow. Although I do problematize that. However, I agree to a certain extent with the writer of this article, because this is the ground reality for many of us who operate within or across academia. So those who operate in academia carry out a wide diversity of roles and services. And we're all example of that, without which the academic world, as we know it, could not exist. And yet so much of our work, so many of our practices are kind of rendered invisible because they are not high in the so-called hierarchy or not perceived in the same way as, say, writing research articles, publishing in prestigious journals, getting research grants, etc. Those are valid practices too, but they're not the only practices that comprise what's meaningful and what's good about academia. The writer ends her article by talking about this idea of creating an academia for all. She says all people who work in academia have come across these or other unwritten rules at some point in their academic careers. And she's right, I have. Instead of teaching academics how to play by these rules, we should be striving to make the academic environment more egalitarian and truly inclusive for all our colleagues, which is part of my goal in today's presentation. But before I go more deeply into the literature and the theorizations, I want to share where my perspectives are coming from. So a little bit of autoethnographic / autobiographical sharing here. To make it simpler, I actually divided my life up to this point as an adult, as a professional, into 3 parts. So I'm going to first talk very briefly about the decade from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, then from mid-2000s to mid-2010s, and then from 2015 to the present. So my understanding of what practices look like and which practices are valid How do we understand the idea of practice in a more abstract way? All of that comes from my foundational years as a professional. When I started engaging in language teaching, including English language teaching practices in the Delhi metropolitan area. I was born in Delhi. I grew up there. I started working there after finishing my undergraduate studies there. So that period from 96 to 2004 has been really significant. I started by tutoring children at home. Right after I finished my high school, I lived in what in the US would be seen as a gated community. I started tutoring school children in English. And then once I started studying German, a year later, I actually started tutoring school children in German, all the while pursuing undergraduate studies in English literature as well as German language and literature at the University of Delhi, as well as at Max Muller Bhavan or Goethe Schule, as it's more familiarly known across Europe. Now, for me, being able to tutor children was not just a financial necessity, though it was. My family was in a situation where I didn't want to burden my parents with the cost of my education. In fact, I wanted to contribute to the family income. So I started tutoring children at home. And this is just a walk down the memory lane for me. This is the last year of my college at Hindu College, University of Delhi. I and my classmates, we were part of a farewell party and we all dressed up in our fine silks and suits. That's me in case you don't recognize me in the middle. And I'm sharing some of these pictures here just to show the different communities I have participated in over the 25 years of my life as a professional. So after finishing my undergraduate studies, I started working in a transnational publishing company, Encyclopedia Britannica India. And over a period of 3 years, I moved from being a copy editor to advancing to the role of assistant editor. But during this time, I continued teaching languages on the weekends for as long as possible because I was beginning to realize that my real passion, real interest actually lay in teaching, although content creation was also fun. There's another photograph from a long, long time ago. This is me and my colleagues at one of our office sites. So I think I came to a pivotal moment in my life very early in my professional career when after ending my tenure with Encyclopedia Britannica, and I was thinking about what's next. I actually turned down a lucrative position at General Electric in Gurgaon. Now it's called Gurugram. And that time I had also secured admission in the Masters of Education program at the University of Maryland, College Park in US. But I deferred my admission because of, again, the financial situation at home. I wanted to stay in India for at least another year, make sure my parents were in a good financial position before going through the whole visa process and moving halfway across the world. So what I did instead of going for a corporate position was I began to freelance and I taught English to college age students preparing for CAT, Common Admissions Test, which are intensively competitive exams. And they can actually be very stressful for students who are usually competent in math and science, but for some reason are scared of English. So my role was really to help them access academic English in a way that they could then get admission in their preferred graduate programs in management. And then during this time, I was also having a lot of fun creating crosswords and word puzzles as a freelancer. So all this time, I was engaging in all of these different practices, not with the idea of moving only along a linear line, but really exploring different kinds of sites and trying to figure out for myself what was it that I really wanted to do for the next good chunk, if not the rest of my professional life. Eventually, I attended a workshop organized by the British Council India as part of the Hornby ALT seminar series. And it was at this workshop that I experienced another pivotal movement. This is me receiving my certificate of completion from the visitor from Great Britain who had come to train us in the latest best ELT practices. And it was a wonderful experience. It was the first time I was in a room full of other educators and we were all talking about what good language teaching looks like. But I also remember at one point, I was the only person in the room who had actually paid for the workshop from my own pocket, from my own savings. All the other participants were public school teachers, and their schools had sponsored their attendance at this workshop. And one of the teachers there, who was very active and vocal and appreciative of the presenter, the organizers and the presenter, told me in an aside that um, she wasn't really going to take anything away from the workshop in terms of actual classroom-based practices. And I remember feeling really shocked and asking her why. And she said, oh, people come from other parts of the world to tell us how to teach English in our own classrooms, but they don't really understand the ground realities that we operate in. And I remember asking myself, am I doing the right thing by planning to move halfway around the world to another country with the idea that I'll get my master's there and then come back and teach in India? When this is the reality of colleagues in the field, they see that disconnect between Western discourses and South Asian realities. So this was the first time when I began to engage in a little bit more of critical thinking and ask myself, if I were to move to the US, how would I stay grounded and connected with actual classroom reality so that I don't become like the presenter who had flown from England to India to give these workshop series, not realizing that the people in the workshop might not feel that they were taking away much of much value from the workshop. I still think of that conversation to this day. And in some ways, that conversation has guided me over the past 20 years or so. So I did move to the US. I got my visa. I moved to the US, started my master's in education. And in doing so, I did start moving more deeply into the world of TESOL while maintaining transnational connections. And in the many years I spent at the University of Maryland College Park, first doing my master's and then doing my PhD, I engaged in a whole variety of practices. And I've listed them here. Please browse them at your convenience. I won't be able to go into each one of them, but I do want to highlight a couple. At one point, when I was a senior doctoral student, pretty close to wrapping up my dissertation, and I was a graduate assistant in my program, my supervisor, who was very supportive, asked me if I would supervise in-service teachers at local public schools as part of my assignment. And I turned down, and I requested my supervisor to instead give me an alternative assignment, because I did not feel that as an international doctoral student who had never taught in public schools in the US, I was the right person to supervise experienced in-service teachers who might have enrolled up, in our program, and give them the kind of support they needed. So that dissonance that I was already experiencing in my graduate coursework manifested itself in this request that I made. And luckily for me, my supervisor was quite understanding and she gave me an alternate assignment. But this was just one of the many decisions I took during my doctoral career, especially when I decided that I was not going to follow the traditional tenure track trajectory. And instead, I'm going to carve my own path and really follow what I'm passionate about in the field of English language teaching, the practices that I feel are going to be of most value and work directly with students who were in high needs setting. So in addition to doing all of this, I was also keeping my connection with India really strong by volunteering with NGOs and raising, I apologize for the typo there, funds for projects that specifically supported underserved students from lower income households and or rural communities. So this is my first marathon that I trained for, along with a bunch of other wonderful fellow Indians. And this was a marathon where we raised funds for educational projects in India. So I was trying my best to really work hard and stay active across different communities of practice, pay back and pay forward as much as I could. I also, after finishing my PhD, served in full-time administrative and again non-tenure track teacher educator roles for 2 years at my alma mater. And I continued teaching at Montgomery College late into the evenings and on weekends. So let me just step back for a second. I started teaching at the community college while I was working on my PhD. And in fact, that became the site for my dissertation research. And I fell in love with community college-based ELT. It was just deeply meaningful, and it still is to this day. I was talking about it with my co-hosts before this presentation started. There is just something deeply enriching about working directly with immigrant students and international students like me, because for a very long time I was an international student and I am an immigrant in the US now. And helping them move forward in their academic careers, guide them as much as I can. So even though I had these full-time positions at the university, I still wanted to continue teaching as an adjunct. So after working 9 to 5, I would drive to Montgomery College in the evenings and on Saturdays and teach my students there. So um, this is a photograph of me and Fulbright teachers during my day job. These were teachers who were visiting my campus from all around the world as part of the Fulbright program. So again, I was maintaining all of these cross connections, these transnational connections across different sites and different practices during this time. Eventually, I wrapped up my position at the University of Maryland and joined the EAP program as a non-tenure track term assistant professor at George Mason University in Virginia. And I taught international students while continuing to teach adjunct as an adjunct at Montgomery College on weekends. So it was a lot of hard work, but it was also a lot of fun. And it all kind of paid off when eventually in 2016, I got my dream job. I got a full-time position at Montgomery College in their EAP program, and I've been there since, and I've had that sense of stability since then. I joined as an assistant professor, advanced to the rank of associate professor in 2018. In a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, I will probably become a full professor, and I teach primarily immigrant students and some international students, while continuing to engage in volunteer work back home in India. At least until a few years ago. And here's a photograph of me visiting one of the Indian sites with all these amazing happy children who were benefiting from the funds that were being raised through the NGO and the work we were all doing as volunteers. I had to eventually stop because of health reasons and time constraints, and I began to focus more on professional development opportunities at my host institution. I've been part of these different fellowship programs that you can see on the screen in front of you. And I also engage in professional development through special projects beyond Montgomery College. So for instance, I've been working on this 3-book project with colleagues, Suresh Kanagaraja, my mentor for many years now, and of course, Bedreddin Yazan, who was my colleague. And in some ways, we were in the same doctoral program. So we've been friends for a very long time now. So our collaboration came together as part of this 3-book project. And the 3rd book is going to get published this summer, something I'm really excited about. So I've been, again, this is to give you all a sense of where I'm coming from and how complex my life story has been so far. I love this graphic, what people think life looks like, this linear line. But in reality, what life really looks like is this bundle of squiggles and curves and unforeseen turns in life. And we talk about it, I and my colleagues, we talk about it in our book, where we say that, we're creating and operating across unique liminal spaces where our personal professional trajectories transcend the idea of a single community of practice. And again, I want to go back to the idea of what practice looks like in the academic world is actually something that's very, very diverse. And it's important that we honor all the diverse practices that we engage in and not highlight some over the other and say some are more prestigious than the other. So in light of that, I want to talk about how I have constructed my intersectional identities as a translingual, a transnational, and a pracademic. And it's a very complex theorization. So I'm using a simple graphic to kind of to illustrate what I mean when I say intersectional overlapping hybrid identities. So I see myself as a translingual, a transnational, and a pracademic. And it's at the overlap of these three hybrid identities that I construct my intersectional identities. And I'm drawing from literature. For instance, Boylon and Orb talk about how examining one's intersectional identities entails exploring how multiple aspects of identities simultaneously are manifested within interactions with each other. Nash, who has talked about um, criticality in intersectionality, says that generally intersectional literature has excluded an examination of identities that are imagined as either wholly or even partially privileged, although those identities, like all identities, are always constituted in the intersections, by the intersections of multiple vectors of power. And I'm not just reimagining my intersectional hybrid identities in the US, in the American context. I'm actually thinking about them across a global ELT landscape of practices, because I've been engaging in transnational practices throughout my adult professional life. And I draw upon Wenger Trainer and Wenger Trainer's conceptualization when they say a landscape of practice is dynamic by virtue of the communities it comprises. Communities with practices that arise and disappear, evolve, merge, split, compete with or complement each other, ignore or engage each other, and have their own histories, domains, and regimes of competence. So very quickly, when I say translingual, I'm using the term translingual for myself to better capture my trajectory across languages and linguistic contexts. The concept of translingualism is an instance, the way I see it, of what Wenger would describe as an experience of multi-membership, as well as the work of reconciliation necessary to maintain one identity across borders. Those, like me, who function in and across multiple language contexts, which I would assume are most of us who are in this webinar together right now, create areas of continuity on the peripheries of different languages, if we see languages as different and separate entities, and language contexts through reconceptualizing and reimagining ourselves as translingual. So that's the first hybrid identity I see for myself. I want to emphasize that the term translingual offers the possibility of an identity that's not artificially fragmented as L1 or L2, as native English speaker or non-native English speaker, but it's unified and coherent in its crossing of borders, also providing both old-timers and newcomers new models for participating in and across different communities of practice and different practices. So when I talk about transnational, what do I mean by that? So for instance, Levitt describes transnational migrants as people who, spurred by technological advances of the past few decades that allow them to live parts of their social and economic lives across national boundaries, identify home as more than one country, which for me is now actually very true. When I think of home, it's no longer India or the US, it's India and the US. And in some way, it transcends those national boundaries as well. But this webinar is primarily about being a pracademic. So I'm actually going to spend a good chunk of time talking about my hybrid pracademic identity now. I do encourage you all, if you're interested and curious to know more about the translingual and transnational aspects of my intersectional identities, I have some publications out there where I talk about this, and I'd be happy to provide those references if anybody's interested. You can email me or you can ask me in chat at the end of the presentation, and I'll make sure to email the information to you. So let's talk about my hybrid pracademic identity now. Again, a simple visualization. If we say practitioners belong to one community of practice and academics belong to one community of practice, then at the overlap of those communities and those two sets of practices are people called pracademics. And I identify myself as one of those people who would identify themselves as pracademics. It's a portmanteau term combining academic in senses of both person and subject matter and practice or practitioner. As a pracademic, I am both a practitioner and an academic. As Posner would say it, I'm a boundary spanner, creating intersections of theory and practice and locating my work at the overlaps of research and teaching. It's the only term that I've come across that enables me to visualize myself on a professional track where I can remain both a practitioner and an academic and simultaneously participate in the community of ELT research while moving more deeply into the community of teaching diverse adults English as an additional language in a high needs context, which in my case is a community college context. So um, for those of you who are here, I'm going to ask you to do one more quick activity. If you do use these terms, academe, academia, or something else, can you write in the chat box which term you prefer to use? Is it academe, academia, both, or maybe something else in your in your context of practice? Maybe you don't use these terms at all. You use something else. So if you could share that, that would be wonderful. And I'll share why I'm asking this question in a few seconds. So I have noticed that, 3 years ago when we had TESOL on site, I noticed that a lot of people who were presenting seem to have switched from using the term academia to the term academe. And when I read articles from, say, the Higher Education Chronicle, Chronicle of Higher Education, social media feeds, I've noticed that there also people seem to be gravitating towards the word academe. And I was just curious, because as an insider, outsider, I'm not privy to the conversations necessarily that show this switch or transition from one term to another, but I do understand how academia functions. So I can take an educated guess as to what might be happening. For instance, one good thing that is happening is we are moving away from the term English language learners in the US to English learners. And now we're talking more about using terms like emergent, bilinguals, and multilinguals, which in my opinion is a move in the right direction. But this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I did something that I teach my students to do, which is to look up the etymology and current use of words that they come across. And I was curious as to, between academe and academia, which one seems to be more current and more popular. And I found out that at least according to Google's search algorithms, the word academe seems to be actually going down in use. It seemed to have peaked a decade or so ago in terms of use, and now it's kind of becoming less popular compared with academia, which seems to be again rising in popularity. So again, there's a reason why I'm saying this. Remember, in this part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about decentering, quote unquote, academe. And I'm trying to do that literally and figuratively. For those of you who were here for the initial part of my presentation, you may remember that I talking about two sides of the same coin in terms of how we define practice and how we identify productivity. And of course, that was a slightly negative spin on how those terms have been conceptualized so far in the academic world. Now I'm going to put a more positive spin and move this conversation forward by talking about the fact that, at least for me, we're all pracademics. As members of a global TESOL community, when we all participate in and across a wide range of professional roles, teachers, teacher educators, researchers, mentors, administrators, students, our diverse, dynamic, complex, and overlapping practices means that we're all pracademics. Again, as Wenger writes, some communities may specialize in the production of theories, but theory production also is a kind of practice, just like teaching is a kind of practice, just like mentoring is a kind of practice, and so forth. And then understanding productivity in all its diverse forms is critical in terms of moving the field forward in a positive direction. Teaching, and specifically teaching academic English, in my case, is a key form of productivity, along with any and all of the other roles that we academics perform in our sites of practice. In fact, as educators in the field of education, including those who identify themselves primarily as teacher educators or academics or academics, teaching should be our central practice, as well as central to all our practices. And hopefully it is. So I started my presentation by looking back on my own life trajectory with all its complex and complications. And now I'm going to look forward and ask what's next for our field. So I am looking forward by looking at my own hybrid intersectional identities. And I love this quote by Julian Edge where he says, our prevailing image of crossing borders is of moving from one area or one stage to another. Yet a great deal of contemporary writing stresses the importance of in-betweenness, of new hybrids, which do not resolve themselves in terms of either or-ness. And I just want to emphasize that Edge said this in the late 90s. But this is more true than ever now in our current era of globalization, of transnationalism, of hybrid identities, hybrid practices, literally and figuratively. It's those in-between spaces where the richness of the constellation of our practices really emerges. All right, Nash also talks about marginalized subjects have an epistemic advantage, and I do see myself as a marginalized subject by virtue of being a woman, a person of color in the US context, a perceived non-native English speaker, again, in the Western context. All of these identities, an immigrant, again, in an American context, oftentimes these identities are marginalized in professional and personal spaces. But that marginalization gives me an epistemic advantage, a particular perspective that other scholars should consider, if not adopt, when crafting a normative vision of a just society. My complex and multi-layered construction of three distinct in-between identities across varied landscapes comprising different communities and their diverse practices enables me to create spaces of agency, such as this one here in this webinar, where I'm attempting to negotiate, resist, and contest certain problematic orientations that pervade, unfortunately, the contexts that I and others like me operate within and across. Suresh Kanagaraja has talked about this also. So in the same vein, I explore my critical self-positioning in this in-between space by employing, in this case, an autoethnographic lens to describe my three intersectional hybrid identities that I have reimagined for myself. And in doing so, I further illustrate how I continue to use these identities to create counter narratives to prevalent deficit discourses around professional practices and roles, language use, especially English language use, and immigrant identities. Now, I've talked about this before in my other presentations, actually, so some of you might be familiar with some of the things I'm saying here. In this webinar, I'm going one step further. I may have started this journey by seeing the two roles of practitioner and academic as separate but cohesive dualities. And I'm now going one step further to say that the term pracademic is an example of the sum being greater than the parts. What do I mean by that? Not only does being a pracademic highlight the role of practice and practitioner, it also calls attention to the idea that being an academic is also a kind of practice. And it puts that aspect first and foremost, literally and figuratively. It thus makes visible what's often rendered invisible or less visible in academia, when practice is actually the core or the essence of the work we do in the field of education, across educational roles and across global contexts. Thank you so much. I've been talking for almost 40 minutes now. My throat is kind of parched, but I would welcome any questions or any comments that you may have. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rashid. This was wonderful. I do want to remind the audience that if they have any questions, they can put them in the chat. We can take, we have 20 minutes approximately for the Q&A. So if anybody has questions, we can take a few minutes for you to compose those and add them to the chat.
Thanks so much, Christina. I realized that I might have been speaking a little fast, and then the transcription may not have been transcribing what I was saying correctly. Again, the skewed algorithms that we work with. But again, if anybody has any questions or would like me to repeat something that I mentioned earlier in my presentation, I would be happy to do so. I was keeping an eye on the clock to make sure I finished my part of the webinar in 40 minutes. So we would have enough time for questions and answers. So please, if anybody has any questions or comments, please do share them.
The transcript, it always messes things up. Like it never captures proper names. It has trouble with that, like always. But I think it did a good job capturing, most of what you were saying. So somebody other than expressing their gratitude for a wonderful presentation and a fruitful and brilliant presentation, somebody asked if you can share the references.
Sure. What I'll do is, Christina, I'll send you the references, and then if you could forward them to people who are here or who may have signed up for the webinar,
Okay.
that would be really helpful. So I hope the person who's asking for the references, would that be okay? If I send it to the organizer and then Christina forwards it to everybody. Oh, and yeah, Christina has put her email in there. So
Yeah.
I'll email the list of references to Christina. I believe this is all being recorded. So with the
Yes.
recording and the references, hopefully that'll be sufficient.
Yeah, I don't know if because I didn't get a list of participants, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to reach out to them, but I can either speak to Nancy so that she can share the references with them, or they can email me and I can share this with them if they want.
What I'm doing is right now, I'm actually putting my own official
Okay.
email. Let me make sure this is the right. Yeah. So I'm putting in my own email in the chat box. So Christina, people can reach out to you, and anybody who would like a list of the references from this presentation can email me directly, and I'd be happy to provide those references and also answer any additional follow-up questions that people may have.
Yeah, I think that's a better idea. Thank you, Rashi. I do have a question. If people don't have questions, I have at least one question. I think two, but I'm gonna start with one and see where it takes me. I love this idea of Pracademics as being larger than the sum of its parts, right? Of both things separated. And so I was wondering if you can expand a little bit more and tell us what that looks like in a class, for example. Do you use autoethnography or narrative-based writing with your students so that they can see these identities as hybrid, as intersectional as well? And if you do, can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like?
Sure. I mean, that's a great question. But remember, I'm not in a teacher education program.
Right.
I work with students who are preparing for college studies, but I do make sure that when I'm working with my capstone students in my integrated skills class, where we integrate reading, writing, listening, speaking, and critical thinking, all into one more realistic, use of language, I do introduce them to the idea of transnational migrants. And when I do that, I introduce myself as a transnational, a translingual, because I also talk about hybrid language practices, something that we all do in my classroom. My students and I, we engage in hybrid multilingual practices, translingual practices all the time, because my students like me are immigrants or internationals and speak at least two, sometimes many more than two languages. So I try to introduce these concepts to them at the level which is compatible with where they are in their academic careers. And it's amazing the kind of rich conversations and discussions that emerge, because my students bring in raw lived perspectives to those classroom discussions. But I can also see how this could apply in teacher education programs. Because that is an area of interest. I think you have that area of interest too. These are, you could think of them as case studies where a practitioner, Pracademic like me is trying to introduce the ideas, hybrid identities in my classroom to validate who my students are. I mean, that's the end goal. We are often surrounded by deficit discourses about our language use, our immigrant identity, etc. As people of color, for example. So there's racialization that happens along with marginalization. So I'm trying to counter those narratives by talking about how hybrid linguistic practices are a strength, not a weakness, which is often contrary to the kind of discourses we see in higher education settings, not necessarily conferences, but in actual sites of practice. So I try my best to incorporate these perspectives and make the sum being, be larger than the parts that make up my identity as a academic. Did I answer your question, Christina?
Yes. I was actually thinking about your I forgot what class it is that you said that you're teaching, the integrated reading, writing, speaking English language class, right? I was just curious about what kinds of stories, what kinds of identities come up in those kinds of learning environments.
Absolutely
And
great. Yeah, great.
sorry, just thinking about students, and what they're bringing to those learning moments. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think Maya also asked a question. So as soon as I finish answering your question, I'll go to Maya's question too in the chat box.
Yes.
It's really incredible. Our students, my students, have not been yet socialized into the academic discourses like we take for granted when we go to conferences, for instance. So when I introduce the idea of being translingual to them, it's not like some big aha moment that nobody has mentioned this to us before. For them, like, it's, yeah, of course. That's what I do. My students who speak Spanish and English, I am often teaching them how to use their Spanish to master academic English words, because academic English words have true cognates in everyday common Spanish that my students can master fairly quickly. But then I might have been the first professor who's strategically teaching them how to do it. And they have this like, oh yeah, this makes sense. Let me try this out kind of a thing. So my students are very receptive to the idea of validating different languages after they overcome that initial shock of their English professor telling them to use multiple languages. And I do it like I demonstrate to my students how I use my multiple languages to master, for instance, the correct pronunciation of their names. Hindi is my first language. So sometimes students who come from all over the world have different names that I might not be familiar with. And I write it down in Hindi, which is a more phonetic language. And I show them via Zoom these days, I show them what their name looks like in Hindi. And I tell them why I'm writing it down in Hindi, to master the pronunciation of their name and to say it correctly from there on. And I tell them, if you happen to know a language that's more phonetic than English, use it. Use it to master new academic English vocabulary. So those are some of the ways that my students bring in their stories, and then I validate those stories. Is it okay if I go and answer Maya's question quickly now?
Yes. Do you mind reading it aloud just in case somebody's accessing from their phones or something? And then go ahead and answer.
Sure. So my question was, along this journey, would you please tell us some of the challenges that you have encountered and how did I deal with such challenges? Sure, Maya. I mean, in the time we have remaining, I'll just share a couple of um, challenges. I mean, I call them stumbling blocks that I've turned into stepping stones in some way. So for instance, right from the beginning, 17 years ago, 2004, when I came to the US, right from the beginning, I would have people compliment me on my English. In a positive way. They thought they were complimenting me by saying things like, "Oh, your English is so good," and many times that compliment would be followed by a comment like, or a question like, "How long have you been in the US?" So there were two layers of problems there. One, why would I be complimented on my English? I mean, I had spoken English all my life in India in both personal and professional spaces, and nobody had ever actually complimented me or told me how articulate I was in India, because everybody around me was like me, right? With different varying degrees of proficiency and expertise and ownership of all the languages we used on a daily basis. And then the second problem was the follow-up question, how long have you been in the US? It took me some time to make the connection that for people in the US, my high proficiency in English suggested I had been in the US for a long time. And if I had not been in the US for a long time, then they were surprised by my high proficiency in English. So those experiences created a certain amount of cognitive and emotional dissonance on top of the culture shock and the transition that we all go through when we move halfway around the world and try to become active participants in a completely new culture and community. But again, those moments, instead of being stumbling blocks, became stepping stones, because then they became central to my research questions and my self-identification, my practices as an English language teacher, researcher. So that was one that I experienced early on in my transition to the US. More recently, I've been resisting the use of the term non-native English speaker, especially where my students are concerned. So I have replaced the term non-native English speaking students in all my syllabi with the words multilingual English users. Because I understand that the NS movement has been so powerful, and has been a place of agency for many of us. But I also problematize how the label is used to other my students, for instance, is used in a deficit way. And my students are not in the position sometimes to push back. They may not even understand why that might be used in a deficit way. So I have been trying to consciously use a more additive, asset-based term in my syllabi, in my site of practice, not just in conferences and webinars like these. So I hope I answered your question about some of the challenges I have faced.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Interesting to hear that.
Well, I mean, you're in Egypt, so I'm sure you see different kinds of challenges over there. I, as an Indian in the US, these are some of the challenges I have encountered. But I think the idea of linguicism and linguistic layers of discrimination, it's fairly universal. It just happens to look differently. In India also, there is linguicism, there's colorism, the parallel of racism in the US. And some of those things I didn't really completely understand until I moved to the US and began to think critically about these ideas. And again, through this webinar, my goal is to validate all the different practices we engage in all the different contexts we operate within.
Yeah, I do agree. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mai.
I wanted to make sure that we have a few minutes to at least consider Soyun Han's question. They said that they joined in the middle of the webinar, so they might have missed it. But can you share some of the prompts, questions that you use in the classroom to help students explore their multiple identities?
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that question out by Soyun Han. Christina, Soyun, I'm actually working on a manuscript that goes into much more detail and depth to, in answer to this question, but I'll share a quick example. So in one of the modules that I teach my student in my academic English program is actually a module called Englishes, global Englishes and multilingual English users. And there I introduce my students to the idea of multiple Englishes, that the fact that there are many standard Englishes, there are many variations within English in different contexts. And some of it is new for students and some of it is not. But then I problematize, I create trouble in my own class by asking my students if they're familiar with the term non-native English speaker. And those of them who have been in the US for a bit of time are. And then I ask them, would they identify me as a native English speaker or a non-native English speaker? And it's always interesting the kind of discussion it generates. And I try to move my students away from those terms, but they have to first explore what those terms mean, what those labels mean, for them to be then able to move beyond those labels. And then I introduce to them the idea that I don't see myself as a native English speaker or a non-native English speaker. I see myself as a translingual/multilingual user of many languages, including English. And I also tell them for the first 25 years of my life, we did not use these labels in India. I was 25 when I moved to the US. So it was in the US as a person in my mid-20s with a very strong sense of self, as an English user, as an Indian, that I first came across these labels, native English speaker and non-native English speaker. So I try to bring in my perspectives and my experiences and introduce those to students, and then I try to draw students' stories through classroom discussions. If they have faced linguistic racism, if they have been labeled as non-native or native English speakers, and what that means for them in terms of their self-identities, how they identify themselves. And of course, all of this is in the context of teaching my students academic English as well as college level skills. I hope I answered your question.
That's lovely. Thank you so much for sharing so many ideas, details, and so much from your own experiences, right? We have 4 minutes left. I wonder if anybody else has another question. Han said that she's looking forward to your upcoming work.
Thank you so much. I hope it will be out soon. In a few more months, I have to make some minor revisions and resubmit the manuscript, but hopefully it'll be out soon. I actually already have a publication from 2014 in TESOL journal called Global English. It starts with the title Global English. When I send a list of references, I'll include that reference as well. And it talks about how at that time I was conceptualizing the idea of multiple identities and hybrid identities in the classroom setting, so with real pedagogical implications.
Thank you so much, Rashi, for this. I think that you have given us a lot to think about in terms of, our own praxis, but also in terms of bigger ideological issues as well that we may be grappling with, perhaps the labels that we use. And so I'm super grateful for all of these. I just wanted to emphasize that one more time before we go. Here in the chat, Hans saying, I'm in the field of teacher education and your talk today gave me so much food for thought. Yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Remember that you're going to have access to this video recording in a week or so. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You have Rashi's email and my email as well. Thank you, everyone. This was lovely.